We have copies available at the registration table, or just ask Susanna. And this is our gift to you today, so I hope you'll take advantage of it. Before I turn the podium over to Stuart, I'd just like to note that the Madison Project has a steering committee which provides advice on program activities and direction. It's chaired by the legendary First Amendment attorney Floyd Abrams, who is not able to join us today. But we do have other members of the steering committee here with us. I'd like to introduce them briefly. If I could just ask them to stand, we'll recognize them. Pat Butler, President and CEO of America's Public Television Stations. Will Johnson, Senior Vice President of Federal Regulatory and Legal Affairs for Verizon. Kathy Kirby, a partner at Wiley Ryan, where she co-chairs the firm's telecom, media, and technology practice. And Mike O'Reilly, former FCC Commissioner, Senior Fellow at the Media Institute, and a private consultant. We're also fortunate to have Ben Slivka as a member of this group. Ben is a well-known figure in the tech industry who spent most of his career with Microsoft and is based in Seattle. We're grateful to all of our steering committee members for their involvement in the Madison Project. I just want to thank them very much for what they're doing. I'm extremely happy to welcome our distinguished speaker here today to remind us of the critical stakes at hand and to speak about the special role that all of us in media can play in advancing a bedrock of American democracy, the First Amendment. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Stuart Brotman.
Thanks, Rick. It's a really great pleasure to be here and have so many good colleagues and friends and familiar faces and a number of new faces, and hopefully we'll get to know each other over time. So let's talk about Madison. So Madison is embedded in our daily lives. The epicenter of advertising, Madison Avenue. When we want to see the Knicks or the Rangers or more recently Billy Joel play, where do we go? Madison Square Garden. And of course, a few blocks from here is the first modern luxury hotel that was opened in Washington, D.C. in 1963. And the name of that hotel is the Madison. That brings us, of course, to Dolly and James Madison, who are the namesakes for many of these institutions. So just to give you a little bit of history, for some people who know it or some people who don't. So Dolly Madison had been married previously. Her name had been Dolly Todd, and she was 17 years younger than James Madison. And James Madison did not yet have eHarmony, so he needed to find someone, and he ultimately went to an analog version of eHarmony at the time, and that analog version's name was Aaron Burr. And so Aaron Burr actually introduced Dolly Todd to James Madison. And of course, Aaron Burr later on turned out to be the person who murdered one of the founding fathers, Alexander Hamilton. So there's a good deal of irony there. So let me talk a little bit about Dolly Madison first. Obviously, we know that she loved to serve ice cream and loved to eat ice cream. But part of that was because she was really the first great social hostess in Washington, D.C. And one of the great legacies that Dolly Madison has left us, or hopefully will be revived, is the notion of bipartisanship. So once upon a time, we had an extremely partisan environment. In fact, Thomas Jefferson refused to meet with anyone who was not in his political party. And there was also a lot of violence that went on. So as you know, Aaron Burr shot Alexander Hamilton, but there were frequently duels and there were physical altercations over politics. And so Dolly Madison had the idea, can we bring all of these people together so we can begin to have a civil and constructive dialogue? And she is actually really the pioneer of what we know as bipartisanship. partisanship. Of course, unfortunately, she is not with us today, but hopefully that spirit can be revived at some point in time because of the obvious great rancor that we have now in our country between our political parties. So what's also interesting about Dolly Madison was that Dolly Madison was actually the first lady of the United States. And Thomas Jefferson had been widowed, and he didn't have a partner. And so Dolly Madison, who of course was not married to him, she said, I will volunteer to essentially be your official hostess when you have different events. And so she really trained for that role. Thomas Jefferson, of course, was the third president, and he was succeeded by James Madison. And at the point that Madison was elected, then Dolly Madison at that point became the first lady of the United States. And she is the only first lady in the history of our country who was given an honorary seat on the floor of Congress. So she was such a powerful figure. And certainly when we talk about the Madison Project and Madison, I didn't want anyone to forget about Dolly Madison because she's a critical and important figure in American history. So that brings us, of course, to James Madison. James Madison, as you know, was small in stature, but very big in ideas. And he is one of our 7 founding fathers. I'm not going to call on people, but there are 7. And if in Q&A you want to ask who they are, I actually do know who they are. So he was one of the 7 founding fathers, and of course had such a critical role to play in the development of the Constitution and, of course, ultimately the Bill of Rights. What's interesting about Madison is that he really was a team player, and he wrote, in fact, the Constitution was not like the fabled goddess of wisdom, the offspring of a single brain. It ought to be regarded as the work of many hearts and hands. And so he clearly wanted to share credit. Madison really opposed this idea of the Bill of Rights, but ultimately Jefferson persuaded him that we needed greater protection than was put in the original Constitution. And so basically Madison said, I will pick up that mantle and I will develop these amendments to the Constitution. Of course, those first 10 amendments are what we call the Bill of Rights. More critically, or perhaps just as critically, he wrote 29 of the 85 essays that we know as the Federalist Papers. And the Federalist Papers are an incredible resource, basically giving the philosophy of how our Constitution was developed and also how our Bill of Rights were developed. So in Federalist number 9, which was one of those 29 that Madison wrote, he said, the people are the only legitimate fountain of power, and it is from that the constitutional charter under which the several branches of government hold their power is limited. So Madison was very concerned about the potential overreach of government. And of course, that's reflected in the Bill of Rights. And so he basically was the architect of this idea of how do we build a wall, or at least a barrier, between government and the people to prevent the government essentially from going over that wall and encroaching on their personal liberty. The 45 words that he wrote were precise and they were elegant, and of course they remain enduring and they're worth saying and hearing. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. 45 words. incredible number of ideas and obviously an enduring legacy. Unfortunately, I think both James Madison and Dolly would be dismayed if they were with us today, because we now have sophisticated ways to measure how people perceive the First Amendment, how people perceive the notions of free press and free speech. So I want to spend a few minutes reviewing the results of a few recent national surveys to give you a little flavor of basically how people are perceiving the First Amendment today. Let me start off with a little bit of good news. According to a 2022 survey by the Knight Foundation, 89% of adults see freedom of speech as a democratic essential. So that's obviously great news. We'd like to have that higher, but 89% is a pretty good number, particularly as I tell you about some of the other numbers. I think you'll see the contrast, because the surveys then begin to take a pretty dramatic downward turn. So for example, a survey in July 2023 by APM Research Lab found that only 45% of adults believe that democracy, while somewhat problematic, is the best system to have in place. The Freedom Forum found in its most recent survey, which is called Where America Stands, that only 33% of people were aware that entertainment is protected by the First Amendment, and only 4%, I'm going to repeat this, only 4% indicated that freedom of the press is essential. Only 4%. The Knight Foundation in 2022 found that only 59% felt that news organizations should not face government censorship when putting out the news. 59%. And this year, we've had some major surveys, principally by the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. I don't know if someone is here from FIRE. FIRE, as you know, is just a terrific organization which is now involved in a lot of advocacy and research in the First Amendment. So FIRE found in its most recent survey, 2024, that only 25% of Americans believe that freedom of speech is secure. 69% believe it is off track and headed in the wrong direction. The results from college campuses, as we've seen in recent weeks, is just as sobering. So another FIRE survey, which was done in conjunction with the Cato Institute this year, found that only 37% of students think it is never acceptable to shout down a speaker, and only 55% think it is never acceptable to block other students from hearing the speaker. And a growing number, 27% in that survey, believe that violence can be an acceptable answer to stop a campus speech. So these are all some very, very sobering numbers. There's also another strain of sobriety that I wanted to talk about, and obviously I think it hits closer to home with respect to media and communications. So last year, Gallup found that only 32% of Americans trust the news media. 39% have no confidence at all in the news media, and we saw that the comparison with 2016 is quite dramatic. So at that point in time, 27% had no confidence. Now we're up to 39%. And of course, getting back to this polarized environment, we see that although 58% of Democrats trust the news media, 11% of Republicans do, and 29% of independents. So we have a pretty polarized environment with respect to trusting the news media. And a survey that was done by Pew in 2023 found that 71% of the respondents there thought that news and information was being made up and was a big problem for our country. So the data tells us a lot in terms of where things are and where things may be headed. So in light of what I just told you, I think it's timely to ask WWJMD, what would James Madison do? So as I said, Madison was not just a great constitutional architect. Many of you may not know that he was also a media mogul in his own time. So Madison founded a paper called the National Gazette, and he also founded the really first political party, which is called the Democratic Republican Party. And he then had the National Gazette essentially be the media resource for the party, and so he used that as a way to advance the ideology of the Democratic Republicans. In some ways, the National Gazette in its time was the Fox News or the MSNBC of that era. But he felt it was important for media, obviously, to have sharp ideological distinctions, and he was very proud of being able to start a publication not with the idea of being fair and balanced, but with the idea that other publications would start and have opposing thoughts there. He thought, again, getting back to the individual idea of freedom, that people had the ability to hear information from all over and to make decisions. He wrote in 1791, which is, of course, when the Bill of Rights took effect, he wrote an essay called Popular Basis of Political Authority, and in there he said, public opinion sets bounds to every government and is the real sovereign in every free one. So in light of that, here's what I think James Madison would say if he were standing here today talking to you. I think he would recognize that media and communication companies, whether individually or through trade associations, are critical in both restoring the confidence in our cherished First Amendment values and also in improving and enhancing trust in media, especially, of course, this year as Americans return to the ballot box to elect our 45th president. Public opinion is really essential here, and of course, media helps drive public opinion. So what are some things that might be done? Let me give you some data and then we'll go from there. But according to FIRE, again in 2023, only 40% of Americans today can name one right that's protected by the First Amendment. And as we know, there are 5 freedoms. I've just told you what is in the First Amendment for those 45 words. But only 40% of Americans can even name one of those rights. Freedom of speech is the one that people most think about, but there, only 63% of people can say that freedom of speech is protected under our Constitution, and freedom of the press is only at 20%. So that gives you a sense of sort of where we are and where I think we need to go, and where I think media and communications companies have a critical role to play in helping to shape and improve public opinion around free speech and free press. So what might be done to have that level of improvement? So let me at least suggest a few things, and certainly when we open it up for discussion, I'm very eager to hear some of your ideas as well. So I think the first thing that would be great is if every company here and every trade association, if you took those 45 words and put them on your website, or had a pop-up on your website, or put them on social media. I think many people have never actually seen what the First Amendment looks like. And again, we all know how to do the Pledge of Allegiance. Most of us don't know how to recite the First Amendment. And not that we eventually would have people recite it, but just to have people visualize and see how powerful those words, when they're put together, can be. I think it would also be very useful if, again, companies and trade associations here went to the public libraries in their local communities and said, we will make a banner that you can hang as you walk into the public library with those words of the First Amendment. And I think that libraries would be very happy to accept that gift, and in fact, I think they would be proud to display it as they should. And an additional aspect of libraries might be companies and trade associations here donating maybe a collection of books around free speech and free press to individual local libraries. And so when kids and other people come in, there will be a little bookshelf on First Amendment books. And of course, we are now in the era of e-books. And so you can basically have all of these books available digitally to a very, very wide audience. In 1976, some of you remember that CBS pioneered something called the Bicentennial Minute. So that was the 200th anniversary of our country, and CBS said every night they would basically have a person, often a celebrity, sometimes a news person, come on and talk a little bit about our Constitution and our history. Well, as you know, 2026 is approaching. 2026 is the 250th anniversary of our country. And I think it would be a great idea, again, you are the powers that be in media and communication, if we now have a new effort to produce bicentennial minutes for YouTube. And so beginning in 2026, every day there will be a new 1-minute video that's posted, produced, or perhaps sponsored by your organizations. But again, what we need to do is raise public opinion and try to reverse the course that I've suggested here that the data is showing. Perhaps most importantly, I think internally in your own organizations, there are new generations of people coming to work. There are intergenerations of people working, and I don't think there is the level of knowledge or appreciation about the First Amendment. And so I think internally, companies and trade associations need to essentially do a little bit of education and discussion around the First Amendment. And again, these are the shapers of public opinion, so it's exceedingly important. No field has benefited more from the First Amendment than our fields in media and communications. And of course, it's in our business interests as well as a real civic responsibility as stewards of free speech and free press to support the First Amendment every day. So let me close on a positive note. As Rick mentioned, I have a book and I titled it, The First Amendment Lives On. And it's titled that way because there really is a sense of optimism I have that if we have proper attention and focus in this area, we're all going to be part of keeping alive the profound lessons that James Madison left behind. That's as good a place to close as any, and so now I'd like to welcome your questions and comments. Thank you.
Forgive me if you will for going down a rabbit hole, but the one question, the wording was people would choose, could they name parts of the First Amendment? And free speech, 60-some% did. Free press was way down below. Isn't free press a component of free speech? Having been a journalist all my life and subpoenaed in 2 criminal cases, it basically came down to free speech.
Well, that's not the way the First Amendment was designed, because Madison clearly, and I already told you about his background as a press baron of his time, but he really had this notion that the press was the amplification of speech. The way that people could find out what was happening was not by having individuals essentially talk to each other, but to have media sources, and those media sources were called the press. So freedom of the press is a really distinct concept from freedom of speech. And when we talk about the 5 freedoms of the First Amendment, obviously we talk about the religion clauses, we talk about the speech clause, we talk about the press clause, we talk about the assembly clause, and the petition clause. So the idea there is each of the aspects are related to each other, but they're also distinct from each other. Yes, Mike.
Do you have a view on, you mentioned the 5 freedoms in the First Amendment. Do you have a view on the ranking? There's this belief that by their placement, that they have more significance.
You mean among the 5 freedoms?
Yes.
What's interesting is Bert Newborn, who is a distinguished NYU law professor and former general counsel for the American Civil Liberties Union, he has a notion he calls Madison's music. And he said this, when you read the First Amendment, it's almost like reading the lyrics to a song. And he dissected how the First Amendment was put together, and he had this notion that Madison started out by saying we need to protect what people are thinking, their inner beliefs. And the way to represent that would be to talk about religion, this idea that people had a belief in a higher spiritual value. So that was the first aspect of the First Amendment. And then, of course, once people think things, they need to communicate them. And so he said the next step would be speech. And that would be individual speech. And then, of course, we get back to this notion of amplifying the speech, and that's led us to the press. And then once people begin to get different messages and different information, they want to talk about it. And how do they talk about it? They assemble. And so that's the 4th freedom in the First Amendment. And of course, once people gather to talk, they say, you know, there are things that we like or don't like that government is doing, and we want to go petition the government. So it's a really interesting idea that he has. I mean, Bert Newborn has told me that he actually has had discussions with a number of Supreme Court justices. He didn't name them, but he said that at least 3 current members of the Supreme Court have the view that the First Amendment was constructed in the way that he laid out in Madison's music. Pat?
40 years ago, I was part of the group that founded the Times Mirror Center for the People in the Press, which became the Pew Research Center. And back in those days, we did some really in-depth research on people's views of the press and so forth. And we got very high numbers back then. 70% or more of people who trusted the press, thought we had a useful role to play in society. As you've suggested today, those numbers have plummeted in the last 4 decades. And I just wonder, what do you think happened, and what do we do about it?
Well, I've suggested a few things that we need to do. I mean, part of it is I think the media and communications industries need to step up and meet. This is a challenge. This is a challenge for businesses that are operating, and it's a challenge for our civic responsibility, because media and communications companies have always been central to this notion of a democratic system and values. So I think, as I said, some of the things can be done nationally. You could have, as I said, something as simple as a bicentennial minute every day for a year. People do get to go on